Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about this research. Actually, I should probably use my PowerPoint. So the research that I would like to share with you today comes partially from my book, and I'm very sorry for this shameless self-promotion. I don't do it very often, but occasionally I do. So the research comes from this book, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a second. But this time, when I was actually going through the final edits for this book that came out earlier this year, in January this year, when I was going through the final edits for this book, this one question occurred to me that I didn't really explore when I was going through the material, the sources for this book. And this is, in a sense, this question was enough stimulating for me to actually engage it here and propose it to you as a presentation. So let me first tell you a little bit about this project. So the book is essentially a sort of an ethnography of a life in a prison cell. In Polish prisons between 1944, 45, 56, so immediate post-war time. And I start by contextualizing the Polish penitentiary system that was emerging from the war in Poland in 1944-45. And then I discuss how the group of women that I'm focusing on in this book actually sort of reinvented, refashioned themselves in interrogation cells. And for that, I use only interrogation protocols. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them later. After speaking about sort of this process of refashioning, redefining themselves in an interrogation cell, I tried to look how these women applied their senses to orient themselves in a prison space. So I actually followed them, their lives, how they developed only in the prison cell. Then I have a chapter on their bodies and how they actually use their bodies to gain control over their life in a prison cell. And then there is a part on their prison cell relationships, the relationships that they developed with women that were in the same cells, and also with the men, because before they actually received a sentence, before they went through trial, they were usually kept in investigation prisons, and in investigation prisons, they were kept in cells that were located next to men's cells. So there were a number of relationships that developed through the wall. And sort of, for me, this was their attempt to normalize their life and recreate some of the social relationships that they were stripped of when they were imprisoned. There were a couple of cases when I was able, for this project, to reconstruct life in particular cells based on the prison documents, letters that the women were sending from prison, illegal letters that they were sending and receiving to prison, and cell spy reports that some of the women in the cells were writing, documenting sort of almost minute by minute what was going on in given cells. So there were a variety of social groups, variety of people in those cells, from Polish women of different social classes, different ideological backgrounds, Ukrainian women, some foreigners, occasionally Germans, occasionally British women, and of course the largest group were so-called criminal prisoners or ordinary prisoners. They constituted the larger groups. As far as the sources that I'm using for this project, actually, I should move on, right, with this. Interrogation protocols, as I told you before, this is how interrogation protocols looked like. Some of them are 700-800 pages long. They're usually handwritten. Cell spy reports. And here is a couple of snapshots from the sources that I have for the Ukrainian cases. I explained a little bit in the paper. That was slightly more difficult, actually a lot more difficult for me to access some of the Ukrainian sources. Again, happy to talk about it later. Images of some of the women prisoners. This is interesting because it gives you a chance to look the same woman who was imprisoned twice in 2 different time periods. The first photo comes from 1947, and the second one is from 1950. And this one is interesting because she was imprisoned for the packages that she was receiving from abroad. So sort of the evidence of her crime is in front of her, so you can see why she was imprisoned. So really what was driving this project from the very beginning and was the certain vulnerability that they experienced in prison and how they cope with it and how they talked about this later on and how they integrated their stories of life in those very oppressive conditions into their post-prison lives. Actually, I have one more photo, maybe this one. This is sort of recently rediscovered Stalinist time prison cell, because most of them were renovated throughout the decades, so you don't actually get to see how they looked like at the time period. And this one was recently rediscovered by accident. So the question of Polish-Ukrainian relationships was a partial focus on one of the chapters of my book, and as you can imagine, they were very complicated. There are stories of very positive relationships, and there are also stories of sort of very negative relationships that they're certainly affected by the very painful past. The woman very often in the interviews with me mentioned, that sometimes they try to stay away from the discussion of what happened in Volhynia, but this was something that returned in the discussions very often, and I saw it also in the cell spy reports, in the reports that were coming from those cells. There are also examples of this sort of very patronizing attitude that the Polish women had towards the Ukrainian women. And this was more evident in cases of the woman coming from the east than from Western Poland. And again, I'm trying to go a little bit into that in the paper, and I'm happy to explore it further in the questions. The question of the return was something that I dealt with in the epilogue to this book, trying to look at the conditions of the return of the Polish woman, the Ukrainian woman, and also the communists that were kept in the same cells. And as you can probably imagine, this was nothing surprising. It was actually significantly more difficult for the Ukrainian women to return. Most of their families were deported to the east. They didn't really have a place to return to. The Gulag literature actually supports this assumption of mine that the returnees usually try to use this network of support of their family or networks of support or the people they met in prisons. And in case of the Ukrainian women, it was very difficult for them to use pre-existing networks of support because they didn't have any, because they were very often returning to places that, first of all, didn't feel safe, felt like involuntary home, and their families were gone. They were not allowed to receive, they had many difficulties receiving passports. So this loneliness of Ukrainian women was certainly more overwhelming. Also, according to me, there were, in most cases, the Ukrainian women were actually followed by the secret policy for much longer than the Polish women. Even in the late 1960s, you still see traces of some kind of investigations of the activities of both Ukrainian men and women in the archives. So at the very end, I am actually trying to pose this question: how they incorporated this question of their return into their memoirs. And this was sort of instigated. This question was instigated in a sense, evoked by the research by Patrick Kenny, who actually saw, who in this most recent published book on global imprisonment argued that political imprisonment is a modern phenomenon, and political prisoners actually use their time in prison as sort of a continuation of their struggle. And this was something that I was actually very surprised by when I realized that from the oral interviews and from the memoirs that I had a chance to look at, it was clear that while the Ukrainian women seemed to be seeing the imprisonment, sort of a continuation of their patriotic struggle, for the Polish women, it was sort of more a source of personal enrichment. They were talking about, imprisonment wasn't something that they saw as something that broke their lives. They were very often talking about the relationships they created, the smart women they met, the conversation they had. And you have to remember that the conversations, this comes from the conversations with them that I had sometimes 50 years later, My math may be a little bit off here, but decades after, right? So they actually had time to reflect on everything that happened. The Polish women usually had their own space to actually talk publicly about their experiences. I can, in detail later, talk a little bit more about how the main prison for women actually celebrated the Polish women and they forgot the Ukrainian women. So the Ukrainian women didn't really have space, those that remain in Poland, to talk about their experiences. So some of the factors why the Polish women sort of transformed this experience into something that is more personally enriching rather than, part of their political struggle is almost evident and is very much linked to how they returned. But there was something, and I'm going to finish here with this, but there was something that struck me when I was, again, going through this material just before submitting the final version of the book, so I decided not to think too much about it. But then I think I am almost ready to return this question again, namely the way that Polish and Ukrainian underground was structured. And here I sort of mentioned at the very end that I've noticed that there's a specific rite of passage that women had when entering the Ukrainian underground. This question of marriage and, a number of own UPA recent scholars, Marta Hawryszko, for example, argues that the marriages in the Ukrainian underground were discouraged, and yet, over and over again, I found evidence that women actually did marry, and they received a new name after sort of pledging allegiance to the Ukrainian resistance, and almost a new life started for them, sort of very much linked with the Ukrainian resistance, right? So the question for sort of future research that I hope will come out, or at least, something that may eventually turn into an article, would be what are the differences? And there are obvious structural differences if you look at the Polish and Ukrainian resistance. One is Polish is sort of more urban. Definitely, there are not that many women in partisan groups in Poland. But there may be something in the way the individual sort of was linked to the resistance group between Poland and Ukraine that could explain why Ukrainian women felt more linked to their struggle even decades after they were released from prisons. Thank you.